Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start my presentation today. Can everyone hear okay? By acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and in that vein also make it very clear that today I'm presenting views that are entirely my own and in no way represent any of the communities that I'll be referencing today. So I'll be beginning my remarks today with a three-part introduction. I will first introduce the plant that I'll be talking about, Terminalia ferdinandiana, or commonly known as the kakadu plum. Secondly, I'll introduce patents and the history of intellectual property claims over the kakadu plum. And third, discuss power, how the kakadu plum is being used by Indigenous women to assert traditional knowledge claims and meet local needs. Against that backdrop, I will then critically discuss the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. So, the plant. Terminalia ferdinandiana is the botanical name for the native Australian plant which produces a small yellow-green fruit as pictured on the slide. The species is known by a number of common and Indigenous language names, such as kakadu plum, but also billygoat plum, green plum, bush plum, or salty plum, as well as gubbinge for the Bardi people in the northern area of Broome, Mimaral for the people in the Wadda area, Marunga in East Arnhem Land, and Mardur in the Dampier Peninsula. As indicated on the map, Terminalia ferdinandiana commonly occurs across the woodlands and open forests of the northern part of Western Australia and the Northern Territory. The plant flowers at the end of the dry season, with the harvest period in the middle of the wet season, which is from about January to May. In the early 1980s, research funded by the Australian Institute for Aboriginal Studies was the first to report that Terminalia ferdinandiana fruits had the highest content of vitamin C in the world. Later studies confirmed that the vitamin C content of kakadu plum is more than 50 times that of oranges and other fruits. This led to commercial interest in the nutritional applications of kakadu plum, but given the apparent role of vitamin C for skincare applications, kakadu plum also received significant attention from the international cosmetic industry. And this brings us to the patents. In 2006, the US cosmetic company Mary Kay Incorporated filed a patent application entitled Compositions Comprising Kakadu Plum or Acai Berry Extract. After processing through the Patent Corporation Treaty system at WIPO, the patent application was received by IP Australia in around 2007. After some time, that application was published on the Australian Patent Register, although the patent had not yet been granted at that point. At that time, the application received significant attention from Australian academics and Indigenous communities. Local stakeholders raised questions about the source of the kakadu plum extracts that were used in the skin creams described in the patent. They also questioned the legitimacy of the patent application, given that no prior informed consent or benefit-sharing contracts had been developed with any Indigenous communities in Australia who have traditional knowledge over Terminalia ferdinandiana. Both the stakeholders and the patent examiner from IP Australia raised questions about the inventive step and novelty requirements not being met in the patent application. Now, there's a lot more to this story that you can read about in the literature, but suffice to say that this mounting pressure on Mary Kay seemed to have caused them to withdraw the patent application in October 2011. But that withdrawal only occurred in Australia. Overseas, Mary Kay has successfully obtained equivalent patents in the United States, Canada, and the European Union, including some of the EU member states. Now, this is certainly not the first time that the patent system has been used to claim monopoly rights over native plants over which Indigenous peoples have medicinal or other traditional knowledge. We don't have time to go into those cases, and I'm sure many people in the room are already well versed in them anyway, but suffice it to say that these kinds of issues have received enough international attention that they were reflected in the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity in 1992. Australia, as many of you will know, has ratified that convention. The United States has not. Provisions in the CBD set out requirements for access and benefit sharing, which, again, as most people in the room would be aware, have been supplemented by the Bonn Guidelines in 2002 and the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing in 2010. Now, all of these international instruments have been subject to criticisms from a number of different angles, and even though access and benefit sharing laws were intended to redress some of the tensions between Western intellectual property law and traditional knowledge, what we will see in many ways is that these laws have still reproduced many philosophical tensions, which I will return to later on. But now on to power and Indigenous women. So coming back to Australia, we go to a large town called Wadde in the Northern Territory, close to the Western Australian border. In that town, the local women's corporation have recently expanded their activities to include the sale of Kakadu plum. The Wadde area has a significant amount of wild Kakadu plum available for harvest. However, the community's interest in harvesting Kakadu plum is not founded just upon recent commercial opportunities. Like many Indigenous communities in the area, it's been reported that the Kakadu plum is a common snack during hunting trips, but has been long used as a traditional medicine as well to treat colds and flu, through boiling in water to treat skin conditions, and also has been drunk as a tea. So in the last few years, the Women's Centre have cooperated with philanthropic organisations to purchase machinery and processing equipment and acquired intellectual property rights of a Sydney-based company that had previously been supplying Kakadu plum to the international market. The Women's Centre now acts as a central hub for processing Kakadu plum. Women from the community can now go out and collect the fruit, and they get paid at the Women's Centre upfront by weight for the fruit that gets brought back to that centre. At the centre, they conduct training programs that help the women to understand how to produce invoices, apply for relevant permits to collect the Kakadu plums, and also undertake the harvest properly by making sure that they're caring for land and not damaging the trees in the process of the harvest. Now, this wild harvest method used in Wadde and other communities is seen positively for being more sustainable than monoculture plantations used for many other crops. The issue has been, though, that as government and other actors have engaged with Kakadu plum suppliers, this has often been accompanied by unrealistic expectations and intense pressure to scale up the harvest and reach the international market more effectively. Indeed, the pressure to improve the efficacy of Kakadu plum cultivation has led to unethical moments where collaborators have moved samples overseas for clonal propagation and conducting further research without prior informed consent of their collaborators back here in Australia. Now, many of these interventions are thus accompanied by rhetoric about economic opportunity for women in Indigenous communities. But the collaborators on Kakadu plum research projects have repeatedly emphasised that some of the greatest value to be achieved through the Kakadu plum harvest is actually the annual opportunity for members of the community to go out, collect fruit, engage in intergenerational storytelling, education of the youth in the community, spending time on country, caring for country, and just generally bringing the community together. But in those moments, we see that in some ways, the rhetoric around the Sustainable Development Goals can repeat the mistakes of the Western Intellectual Property Framework and other international movements. When it comes to Goal 5 in particular, the discourse often centres on the gap in economic participation and opportunity for women. And this leads to policies that focus upon education and employment of women insofar as it leads to economic empowerment, where success is measured in terms of things like wages and participation in private enterprise. The United Nations SDG fact sheet entitled Gender Equality, Why It Matters, for example, states that women and girls' empowerment is essential to expand economic growth and promote social development. The full participation of women in labour forces would add percentage points to most national growth rates. So ideas of innovation and development are often grounded in dichotomies that reflect what Plumwood calls the hyper-separation of humans from the rest of nature and reinforce the standpoint of mastery. In the reason-nature dualism, the natural world is often seen to include women, Indigenous peoples, and non-humans, which are subordinated to anything associated with reason, such as Western science and economics. The very framework for development is closely associated with growth and progress from so-called backwardness to modernity. The same rhetoric that has equipped companies like Mary Kay to frame traditional knowledge and plant resources as equivalent raw materials that, once extracted and translated by Western science, become something now worthy of intellectual property protection and commercial value. The Sustainable Development Goals, while referencing the importance of ecological sustainability, in some ways reproduce the economic growth fetishism and anthropocentrism reframed as green capitalism. And as Edelman argues, sustainable development fosters the illusion that it's possible to achieve endless economic growth and social justice while protecting the environment, so that the SDGs promote the delusion that capitalism is the solution rather than the cause of the rupture in the Earth system and the ecological degradation and destruction that accompanies it. Anthropocentrism disrupts many Indigenous approaches to the environment and the relationship between human and non-human subjects. a dichotomy that is not always present in Indigenous knowledge systems. In the case of Kakadu plum, as mentioned, this anthropocentrism manifests as the pressure on Indigenous communities to adopt business models that remove cultural context, strip the Kakadu plum of its spiritual significance, and repackage it in capitalist terms for the international consumer market. Even where concepts of sustainable development purport to overcome these problematic assumptions, the associated goals and policies reinforce the reason-nature dualism that justify efforts to normalize Indigenous populations through rewarding behaviour that conforms to neoliberal ideology. International companies like Amway have historically pressured Kakadu plum producers to shift away from traditional methods of wild harvest and adopt Western horticultural methods like monoculture plantations. And today, government policy and funding rewards business enterprise and large-scale production in the name of providing commercial returns for Indigenous communities and economic empowerment of women. By imposing the framework of economic development, the flow of knowledge and resources that is imagined in Kakadu plum supply chains still upholds the same relationships of power and control that have existed since colonial times. But amidst that diatribe, it's not all bad news. There are important examples where parties to Indigenous Kakadu plum supply chains have embraced the potential to reject economic development for economic development's sake. Collaborators have become more explicit about the fact that many communities are pursuing profit in order to sustain culture, not just to sustain the economy. In Broome in Western Australia, for example, the harvest of Kakadu plum has been improved by an approach that does not view traditional knowledge as an early stage to be left behind in a process of innovation, but a regime with equal value to Western approaches to agronomy and cultivation. Members of the Kimberley Training Institute, for example, engaged in a program for predominantly Indigenous students through the Ballyburu Training and Research Centre. They worked with 3 Aboriginal communities to establish plantations of gubbinge, but this cultivation did not look like a normal plantation. The group used a technique called Savanna enrichment planting, which drew heavily upon the land management techniques used by Indigenous peoples in the area. The research area had set up fire breaks around the perimeter, involved planting gubbinge or Kakadu plum trees within the existing savanna scrub. And by having the 2 cultures walking together, the local gubbinge trees could be restored and the harvest increased. The equal and ongoing involvement of Indigenous knowledge, practices, and people in the project led to significantly better outcomes than the use of Western approaches alone. This idea of prioritising community togetherness, cultural activities, and care for country is nothing revolutionary for Indigenous communities. But it is incumbent on those who seek to improve the lives of women around the world not to idealise economic development as an inherent good, but to remain sensitive to the values and objectives of women who do not wish to be equal if that equality is conditional upon wholesale acceptance of Western knowledge systems, binary conceptions of innovation, and the priorities of nation states. So while binary concepts like the reason-nature dualism have allowed for questionable use of the patent system to gain monopoly rights over Kakadu plum, we've seen that the tremendous success that can ensue when food scientists, horticulturalists, philanthropists, Indigenous communities, and lawyers are willing to form partnerships, develop the new types of business models, and collaborate on terms that leave many of those assumptions behind, particularly the privileging of economic development over other interests. The question remains to be seen whether the discourse amongst the international community will be able to leave behind intellectual comfort of accepting old philosophy without question, and instead embrace the complexity of human relationships and knowledge upon which innovation and creativity is built. Thanks.